The email arrived at precisely 3 a.m., a single ping in the dead silence of my cluttered apartment. I was halfway through debugging a penetration script for a darknet client when the notification blinked on my screen. I paused, wiped the sleep from my eyes, and glanced at it. No subject, no sender, just a single cryptic line. Opportunity knocks twice if you know where to look. I hovered my cursor over the email, every instinct screaming not to open it. My paranoia wasn't unfounded. Anyone in my line of work knew better than to click blind. I scanned the headers, bounced through at least 5 countries and a chain of VPN nodes. Professional, too professional. Whoever sent this wanted me to find it, but not to find them. Then there was the attachment, a small encrypted .txt file. My pulse quickened. There are certain breadcrumbs you don't ignore, no matter how dangerous. I was Connor Holt, and this was my life. Digital lockpicking, navigating the places no one was supposed to go. Call it hacking, call it theft. I called it survival. I copied the file into my sandbox, built a new encryption key, and ran my decryption tools. The file opened clean. One line of text stared back at me. Redistribution project. Join us. Midnight. Below. Below? I frowned. My mind immediately jumped to the darknet forums where I sometimes sold my services. I pulled open my secure browser, launched my private keys, and refreshed the invite-only channels I haunted. And there it was, a forum thread marked with a single skull emoji. No author, no replies, just coordinates pinned to an abandoned industrial sector downtown. The message was intended for me. Someone had been watching. Midnight found me standing in the rain at the entrance to an old textile factory. I'd hacked my share of networks, toppled enough corporate vaults, but I'd always worked alone. I avoided the real criminals, those whose blood ran darker than zeros and ones. But this was different. Whoever had left that digital breadcrumb trail was meticulous, precise, and I was hooked. Inside the factory, the shadows swallowed me whole. The sound of dripping water echoed off rusted beams. Then a single desk lamp clicked on, and I saw him. Wraith. He wasn't what I expected. Rumors painted him as a phantom, a myth stitched together by whispers across hacker circles. But here he was, early 30s, gaunt face, messy dark hair, wearing a leather jacket that looked older than him. He sat at a table, a laptop glowing in front of him. "Connor Holt," he said, not looking up. His voice was calm, confident, like he'd already won whatever game we were playing. "You're late." "I didn't say I was coming," I replied, trying to keep the edge in my voice. "You've been tracking me." "Call it recruitment," he shrugged. "You're the last piece of the puzzle." "What puzzle?" Wraith finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, predatory. He gestured to the space beside him, and the screen filled with documents, graphs, and diagrams that bled across the dark. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, and networks linking oil barons, arms dealers, and corrupt politicians. All the worst the world had to offer. "These men," he said, tapping one profile, "they sit on billions. Money that fuels wars, steals futures, keeps the poor begging. It's locked up offshore, untouchable." "Until now," I asked, my voice low. He smiled. "Until us." Wraith clicked to the next slide. A cascade of charities, disaster relief programs, hospitals, food banks. "We're not just stealing, we're redistributing. Millions poured into charities that actually changed the world." I frowned, skepticism settling in. "You're telling me you're Robin Hood?" His smile faded. "Not exactly. The donations will come with strings, small demands, favors, influence. We're not handing out free money, Connor. We're changing the game." "And the strings?" "You don't need to know the details." I laughed darkly. "You don't hire people like me and expect trust." "Fair enough." He leaned back, hands steepled. "You'll design the architecture, the backdoors, the shadow transfers, the crypto layers. You're the best, Holt. That's why you're here." I hesitated, glancing at the names on the screen. I recognized some, the kind of men who bought countries and toppled governments without firing a bullet. Billionaires so wealthy they ceased to be human. Wraith wasn't wrong, but something about his calm certainty set my teeth on edge. "What's the cat?" I asked. You've got clean hands, he said softly. For a thief. That's your edge. And if I say no? The room went silent. Wraith's dark gaze locked on mine. Then you're in the wrong place, and you never saw me. I thought of the years I'd spent hacking corporate servers, stealing fragments of fortunes that wouldn't be missed. This wasn't some minor job. It was the heist of the century, a billion-dollar redistribution project. I extended my hand. Wraith's smile returned as he shook it. Welcome to the future, Holt. Back at my apartment, I stared at the schematic Wraith had sent over. Offshore servers, banking networks, crypto wallets, all woven together into a web of impenetrable security. But the plan was sound, scarily so. He'd mapped out every contingency, every blind spot. As I pored over the details, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Clock's ticking. First phase begins soon. Don't be late. There was no turning back now. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my monitor and whispered, what the hell have I gotten myself into? Outside, the rain continued to fall, as if the heavens themselves knew a storm was brewing, and I had just signed on to ride its eye straight through. For 2 weeks, I barely slept. I buried myself in race labyrinthine plans, a digital maze stretching across continents, offshore servers in the Caymans, shell companies in Luxembourg, dummy IPs pinging through Russia, China, and beyond. It was a spider web, delicate but deadly. My job was to make it seamless. It wasn't easy. The offshore banks were fortresses, guarded by firewalls designed by geniuses with government budgets backing them. But firewalls were only as strong as the people behind them. I exploited flaws they didn't even know existed. I built the tunnels Wraith needed, silent pathways through which we'd funnel millions from the accounts of oil magnates, arms dealers, and politicians whose corruption oozed through every bit of data I uncovered. I never questioned the targets. Not out loud anyway. If Wraith had chosen them, he'd done his homework. I saw the names, tracked their transactions, and it disgusted me. Men who sat on private islands, sipping scotch while families starved in slums they'd created. Still, doubt lingered like a shadow. What were the strings Wraith kept hinting at? 3 weeks in, I met the rest of the team in a safe house buried under the shell of an abandoned tech firm. It was the kind of place you wouldn't look twice at. Flickering lights, dust-covered desks, the smell of mildew and disuse. Connor Holt, Wraith said as I walked in, arms folded. Meet the crew. There were 4 of them. A tall, quiet woman leaning against the wall introduced herself as Kira. Her silver hair and piercing blue eyes gave her a ghostly look. I'd heard of her before. She was a legend in penetration, testing, and network infiltration. Rumor had it she once hijacked an entire Eastern European power grid. Next was Greaves, a wiry man with jittery hands who looked like he hadn't slept in years. He was the codebreaker, the guy who would brute force any server password faster than you could say, secure encryption. His smile was manic as he sized me up. The architect, nice to see the man behind the code. Then there was Luca, thick-set, arms like hammers and eyes that saw everything. He wasn't a hacker. He was muscle, brought in to take care of any problems that might arise. Everyone plays their role, Wraith said as he led me to a table where 3 monitors displayed our target map. Connor's laid the groundwork. The network is live, clean, and invisible. We're ready to move to Phase 1. What's Phase 1? I asked, crossing my arms. Kira answered, her voice smooth as glass. Extraction. We hit the accounts at 3 a.m. tomorrow, across time zones, coordinated withdrawals, not a penny more than what the cover protocols will allow. They won't see it for days. Greaves grinned. Millions will drip out like water through cracks in a dam. By the time they notice, the lake will be gone. Wraith nodded, his face serious. Phase 2 is redistribution. The charities are already prepared to accept anonymous donations. Disaster relief, medical research, clean water. Connor, you've seen the list. I had, and that's what kept me here. I knew what we were doing was illegal, dangerous, but for the first time in my life, I felt like my skills were being used for something good. Still, the strings Wraith kept referencing tugged at the back of my mind. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes at him. And what happens after the money lands? Wraith tilted his head, studying me. Influence, Connor. Money doesn't just buy power, it creates it. These donations will get us seats at tables that have been locked for centuries. Once we're in, we reshape the rules. The game changes. Kira shot me a sideways look. You're in deep enough to know there's no turning back now. Her words hung in the air like a threat. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling. My mind buzzed with code and connections. But beneath it all, the nagging questions wouldn't go away. I thought about Wraith. He spoke with such conviction, such vision, but there was something else beneath his words, something darker. What did he mean by reshape the rules? Who's to say we wouldn't become the very thing we claim to destroy? I rolled over and unlocked my laptop, tapping into my private system. I couldn't resist anymore. I started tracing Wraith's movements. Where did he come from? Who was he before he became this Robin Hood of the digital age? What I found made my stomach turn. Years ago, Wraith's name, his real name, Elias Rourke, appeared in connection with a failed data heist against a political candidate. The fallout had been catastrophic. The candidate's campaign tanked after a public scandal involving doctored evidence that traced back to Rourke. But worse, lives were ruined. People who had nothing to do with the plan caught in the crossfire. Rourke vanished after that, became Wraith, and now here he was, recruiting me, Kira, and the others to pull off his next grand idea. Suddenly, the charities didn't seem so innocent. If Wraith wanted influence, what was he planning to do with it? I thought about the strings again, how easily those small favors could snowball into coercion. Power corrupts. It always does. I shut the laptop and rubbed my temples. The network was already live. In a few hours, Phase 1 would begin, and there'd be no stopping it. At 3 a.m., we sat in the safe house, watching the digital grid light up like fireworks. Greaves ran his fingers across the keyboard, eyes glued to the monitors. All nodes are live, extraction commencing. Lines of code scrolled across the screens as funds siphoned out of the offshore accounts. Tiny, invisible withdrawals happening in perfect sync. Millions moved in seconds. Kira's voice was steady. No flags so far. They think it's standard activity. Wraith watched in silence, his fingers steepled in front of him. Luca paced behind us, a storm cloud waiting to crack. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt sick. Greaves let out a manic laugh. We did it! They'll never know what hit them. Wraith smiled, calm and deadly. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. As the monitors dimmed, my heart thudded in my chest. Something told me we hadn't just stolen money. We'd started something much bigger, and I wasn't sure any of us knew how to stop it. The safe house felt quieter the next day, but the tension was like a knife on my skin. We'd pulled it off. Millions were gone from offshore accounts, siphoned clean without a trace. By now, the donations were landing across charities worldwide. News outlets were already picking up the story. Anonymous donor gives millions to disaster relief. Sudden funds surge rescues failing clean water projects. If you didn't know better, you'd think it was a miracle. But I knew better. I sat at the far edge of the room, watching Wraith pace as if the world were a chessboard only he could see. His face looked sharper, his confidence more dangerous now that Phase 2 was in motion. Greaves, still jittery with adrenaline, flipped his laptop around to show us the live news feed. They're eating it up. Every headline is kissing our boots. We're gods, man. Digital gods. Kira rolled her eyes. Don't let it go to your head. Phase 2 hasn't even started. I leaned forward, rubbing the back of my neck. What exactly is Phase 2? You've been vague on purpose. Wraith stopped pacing and looked at me, his gaze cutting through the room like a blade. The donations come with instructions, Connor. Strings attached. Little ones at first. Each charity we've chosen owes us nothing. For now. But in 6 months, a year, we'll call on them for favors. I frowned, that sick feeling creeping back into my gut. Favors? Like what? Kira answered, her voice calm but sharp. Advocacy, partnerships, influence. Money doesn't just help, it directs. A well-placed nudge can shift an entire organization's goals. These charities will owe their existence to an invisible hand, and they'll push agendas we set when the time is right. I felt a heat in my chest. We never discussed this. Wraith stepped closer, his calm demeanor hardening. We don't owe the world anything, Connor. We've just bought ourselves leverage, control. These organizations were dying under corruption and inefficiency. We're saving them from themselves. And in return, they'll help us reshape what's broken. Greaves laughed, clearly unbothered. He's right, Holt. Influence makes the world spin. If you think charities are pure, you're dreaming. Everyone plays the game. We're just playing smarter. I stood up, unable to stay still. You're talking about coercion, manipulating charities to bend to whatever we decide is right. Wraith's smile was cold and practiced. And what's wrong with that? Who do you think has been calling the shots all these years? Corporations, politicians, billionaires. They manipulate without blinking, and they never have to justify it. For once, we're shifting the balance. By becoming the thing we hate, I shot back, my voice louder than I meant. Silence stretched for a moment, and Luca, silent as always, stepped forward slightly. His presence alone told me to watch my tone. Wraith didn't flinch. You knew what this was when you signed on, he said, voice soft but firm. And don't pretend you don't believe in what we're doing. I saw the way you looked at those offshore accounts. You know those men didn't deserve that money. You wanted this. I couldn't deny it. I sat back down, swallowing my frustration. Wraith gave me a long, assessing look before turning back to the team. Phase 2 begins today. I've prepared communications for each of the organizations. Kira, you'll help me anonymize the requests. Connor, I need you to secure the back channels. Make sure nothing ties these strings to us. I nodded silently, my mind racing. I could already see where this was going. We weren't giving. We were trading, buying power under the guise of generosity. And if the charities ever pushed back, we had the receipts. Hours turned into days, and the team operated like a flawless machine. Wraith drafted subtle emails, requests wrapped in polite, well-meaning language. Kira and I buried the communications so deep no one could trace them back. Greaves monitored the accounts to make sure no one was catching on. The first strings were small. A disaster relief fund pushed to prioritize aid to specific regions. A clean water project redirected its focus to one country over another. At a glance, it looked harmless. Smart resource allocation. But I knew better. Wraith was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push without resistance. The more I watched, the more I realized we weren't reshaping the rules like he claimed. We were writing our own. One night, as I sat alone in the safe house, I broke my own rule. I accessed one of the anonymous communications Wraith had sent to a medical research charity, a polite request for their future collaboration on a public health initiative. Harmless on the surface, but when I dug deeper, I found encrypted attachments I hadn't seen before. Files detailing experimental research programs, names of board members, information about pharmaceutical donors tied to the charity. What the hell is this? I whispered to myself. It wasn't just about influence. Wraith was collecting leverage, dirty secrets he could use as blackmail if the charities didn't comply. My pulse quickened as I closed the files and cleared my traces. Wraith wasn't just manipulating these organizations, he was locking them into his grip. And worse, none of us would be able to stop him. I didn't know who to trust anymore. A day later, I received a private message on my secure terminal. Unknown. You don't trust them, do you? Neither do I. Meet me at 2300, abandoned rail yard. My breath caught. Who the hell was this? A leak? A trap? I debated for hours, but curiosity won. At 11 p.m., I found myself standing under a rusted rail bridge, waiting in the dark. A figure stepped from the shadows. Kira. Her silver hair glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and she studied me with her cold, piercing stare. I know what you've been looking at, she said, her voice quiet. You're not the only one who's worried. I blinked. You're watching Wraith too? She nodded. I don't like what this is turning into. He's building something bigger than any of us, and he's not telling us everything. We need to figure out his endgame before it's too late. My chest tightened. And if we don't? Kira's expression darkened. Then we won't just be pawns. We'll be targets. For the first time since this began, I felt truly afraid. The air in the safe house had shifted. Kira and I spoke little after that night in the rail yard, but we didn't have to. Her message had been clear. Keep watching, keep digging, but keep quiet. If Wraith suspected we were working against him, hell, even questioning him, it wouldn't end well for either of us. The team carried on like nothing was wrong. Wraith held nightly meetings, his words laced with that dangerous charisma that kept everyone in line. Greaves was still riding the high of changing the world, oblivious to what was brewing underneath. Luca, as always, remained silent but deadly, his loyalty to Wraith absolute. And me? I played my role. Quiet, focused Connor Holt, the technician who always got the job done. But beneath the mask, I was unraveling. Kira and I worked separately, but in sync. She handled reconnaissance, slipping past Wraith's watchful eyes to comb through his encrypted files when he wasn't looking. I kept an eye on our back-end systems, Greaves's network logs, the offshore accounts, the communication hubs. We were looking for a crack, anything that would tell us Wraith's true endgame. It didn't take long for one to appear. Late one night, while combing through the offshore transaction history, I found it, a hidden account. At first, I thought it was just another shell, one of hundreds we'd used to funnel stolen funds into donations. But the numbers didn't add up. Millions were flowing into this account, not out of it. And they weren't from corporations or oligarchs. They were coming from the very charities we'd saved. I stared at the screen, disbelief washing over me. Son of a bitch, I muttered under my breath. Wraith wasn't just manipulating these organizations. He was bleeding them dry. Little by little, after earning their trust, he was skimming off their donations and funneling the money into his own personal vault. It was brilliant in a sickening way. He'd turned the charities into pawns and then siphoned them until they collapsed, their reputations shattered while he disappeared with the fortune. I knew I needed to tell Kira. The next day, I found her alone in the safe house kitchen, sipping black coffee like she hadn't slept in weeks. She didn't flinch when I slid the tablet in front of her and let her see the account logs for herself. Her brows furrowed as she scrolled, her jaw tightening with each passing second. Finally, she looked up at me. "He's stealing from them," she said flatly. I nodded. Millions. I don't think he ever planned to fix the world. This was always about the money. Kira slammed the tablet onto the counter, her hands curling into fists. I knew he was playing us, but I didn't think he'd sink this low. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "We can't just confront him. If he finds out we're on to him." She shook her head, already thinking. "We need to be smart about this. We gather everything. Proof of the fraud, the offshore logs, the donations. Then we take it to someone who can bury him." "Who?" "Interpol, FBI, someone outside his reach." I swallowed hard. Wraith had eyes and ears everywhere. One misstep, one suspicious move, and he'd see us coming from miles away. But we didn't have a choice. We spent the next 2 days building our case. Kira used her skills to trace the offshore accounts, mapping out the money trail in meticulous detail. I handled the encryption, layering the files under levels of protection even Wraith wouldn't crack. At night, I barely slept, knowing I was living a double life under the same roof as a man who could end me with a single order. I could feel Wraith's eyes on me during our meetings, his gaze lingering just a second too long, as if he sensed something was off. "Everything okay, Holt?" he asked one evening as we wrapped up a briefing. I forced a smile, hiding the sweat on my palms. "Yeah, just tired. Long nights." His smile was thin. "Good. I need you sharp for Phase 3. Phase 3. I didn't even know what it was yet, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. By the third night, Kira and I were ready. She'd finished compiling the evidence. Transaction records, fake donation receipts, emails laced with veiled threats, and uploaded everything to a secure drive. We just needed to transmit it. We met in the dead of night, sitting in my car parked 2 blocks from the safe house. The glow of my laptop screen lit up the dark interior. "You sure we're ready for this?" I asked, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Kira's face was hard, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. "If we don't act now, we'll lose our chance. Ray's going to move the money again. I can feel it." I exhaled slowly, hands trembling as I pulled up the encrypted files. One click and it would all be over. Wraith's empire would start to crumble. But just as I was about to transmit the data, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. You shouldn't have done that. Kira's phone buzzed too. She stared at the screen, her face going pale. Connor! My blood ran cold. My laptop screen went dark. What the hell? I started, but before I could finish, the windows of my car shattered. Hands yanked me out, my laptop hitting the pavement with a sickening crunch. I barely got a look at them. Black mask, combat boots, before something hard struck the back of my head, and the world went dark. When I came to, I was on the floor of the safe house living room. My head throbbed, blood trickling down my temple. Wraith stood above me, calm as ever, holding my shattered laptop in one hand. Kira sat in a chair across the room, her wrists bound with zip ties. Her lip was split, her eyes burning with defiance. You disappoint me, Connor, Wraith said softly. I thought you understood the plan. I thought you were loyal. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. Wraith crouched down, close enough for me to see the cold fury in his eyes. You had potential, but now you forced my hand. You think you can stop me? Do you have any idea how far ahead I am? He stood, turning to Luca. Take care of them. I saw Luca nod, his face blank, and then Wraith walked out, leaving us alone with his silent enforcer. I looked at Kira, whose eyes met mine across the room. I saw the same thought in her expression. We're not done yet. But as Luca approached, unholstering his gun, I knew our time was running out. My mind was still foggy, but adrenaline pumped through me, sharpening my instincts. Luca was a shadow of inevitability, the kind of man who never flinched or questioned an order. He moved methodically, every step deliberate. I darted a glance toward Kira, who was tied down, but her body was tense like a coiled spring. If I was going to make a move, it had to be now, before Luca sealed our fates. Get up, Luca ordered, his voice flat and calm as he yanked me up by my collar. My legs wobbled, but I stood. Luca didn't play games. He didn't monologue. He just acted. I needed to buy time. You really want to do this, Luca? You know Wraith's gonna screw you too. Nothing. Not a flicker of emotion. Luca pressed the cold barrel of the gun against my ribs and motioned me toward the back room. My brain raced as I shuffled forward, pretending my legs were weaker than they were. That's when Kira screamed. Luca! Wait! Her voice cracked the air like a whip, enough to make Luca pause and shift his gaze. It was all I needed. I slammed my elbow into his throat, feeling a dull crunch as his grip loosened. I twisted to wrench the gun from his hand, but Luca recovered faster than I thought. He barreled into me like a freight train, throwing us both to the ground. My back hit the floor hard, stars erupting in my vision. Kira! I choked, gasping for air. I didn't see her move, but I heard the sound of her chair scraping against the floor. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of motion, Kira lunging at Luca's side, a shard of broken glass clutched in her hand. She stabbed downward with all her strength. Luca roared, his grip faltering for half a second. That half second was all I needed. I scrambled up, snatching Luca's gun from the floor. Before he could turn on us, I aimed and fired. The gunshot cracked through the room like a thunderclap, freezing everything. Luca staggered, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. He fell to his knees, his eyes burning with rage before finally going limp. The silence was deafening. Kira and I stared at each other, panting, both of us bloody and rattled. I dropped the gun, my hands trembling. I'd never shot someone before, never needed to, but Luca would have killed us both. We don't have time, Kira said, snapping me back to reality. She was already on her feet, untying the zip ties from her wrists. Wraith's men are probably on their way. I nodded, stumbling to grab my broken laptop and any trace of the evidence we'd compiled. We had to move, and fast. We escaped into the night, leaving Luca's body and the wreckage of the safe house behind us. Kira hotwired a car from the next block, a beat-up sedan with a loud engine. Not ideal, but better than being on foot. We didn't speak as she sped down empty streets, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, my hands still sticky with Luca's blood. Wraith would know we'd escaped. He'd hunt us, and he wouldn't stop until we were dead. We need to get the files out, Kira said finally, her voice tight. We'll find a public access point, library, cafe, something. We transmit it to Interpol and disappear. Disappear, I repeated hollowly. Where the hell do we go? He'll find us. Kira's expression softened, though her eyes were still hard. We'll figure it out. But we're not letting him get away with this. If we send those files, we blow his whole operation open. He'll have nowhere to run. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just mice in Wraith's labyrinth, running toward a trap we couldn't see. We found a 24-hour diner outside the city limits. It was a dive. Greasy counters, flickering neon lights. But it had Wi-Fi. I set up on one of the back tables, Kira keeping watch while I pieced together what was left of the data. My laptop was trashed, but the hard drive was salvageable. I bypassed the corrupted system files, pulling up the offshore account logs, emails, and transaction histories we'd compiled. It was enough to bury Wraith 10 times over. Almost there, I muttered, fingers flying over the keys. Kira's voice was sharp. Hurry up. We've got company. I looked up to see a black SUV pulling into the lot, headlights glaring. Wraith's men. They'd found us faster than I'd expected. Kira, go! I barked, hitting send on the data upload. I watched the files race through the progress bar. 20%, 40%, 60%. Connor, move! Kira yelled, pulling me out of the booth as gunfire shattered the diner window. We ran. My laptop stayed behind, still uploading, but I didn't care. As long as it finished the transfer, we had a chance. Bullets zipped past us as we sprinted toward the alley behind the diner. The SUV doors slammed and I could hear the pounding of boots behind us. Kira took the lead, pulling me around a corner into darkness. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. We vaulted fences, ducked through alleys, anything to put distance between us and Wraith's men. Finally, after what felt like hours, we collapsed behind an abandoned warehouse, hidden in the shadows. I pressed my back against the wall, gasping for breath. Did it upload? Kira asked, her voice hoarse. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I checked the status. A green check mark flashed across the screen. It's done, I whispered. It's out there. Kira exhaled, her shoulders sagging. Good. Now all we have to do is survive. We sat there in silence, the distant sound of sirens echoing through the night. For the first time, I realized how deep we were in. Wraith wasn't just a criminal, he was a ghost. He operated in shadows and we just brought his secrets into the light. I glanced at Kira. Do you think it's enough? She looked at me, her face unreadable. It has to be. But I wasn't sure, because if I knew Wraith, he was already 10 steps ahead, and he wouldn't stop until we paid the price for betraying him. 2 days later, Wraith's empire began to crumble. News outlets erupted with stories of offshore accounts, illicit donations, and shell companies tied to criminal enterprises. Names of politicians, CEOs, and financial giants appeared on the front page of every major newspaper. It was a feeding frenzy, proof of decades of corruption unleashed into the public eye. Kira and I watched it unfold from a rented motel room deep in the countryside, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid cash. The TV flickered in the dim room, broadcasting a special report as we sat on opposite beds, our faces illuminated by the glow. Interpol confirmed the leak originated from anonymous sources, exposing billions in fraudulent assets scattered across offshore accounts. While arrests have begun worldwide, authorities have yet to identify the individuals responsible for the hack. Kira snorted. Anonymous sources. Sure. I didn't share her smile. There was a sinking feeling in my chest, a heaviness I couldn't shake. We'd struck a blow against Wraith, yes, but it wasn't over. They're already spinning it, I muttered. I gestured to the screen where one of Wraith's known associates, a well-polished CEO in a Navy suit, was speaking at a press conference. This data breach has been a malicious attack, not justice. The so-called charitable donations were part of a larger fraud scheme orchestrated to collapse legitimate businesses and mislead the public. He's twisting it, I said bitterly, turning the victims into villains. It's damage control. Kira leaned forward, elbows on her knees. That's what they do, Connor. It's not like they're going to roll over and die. Wraith's people are scrambling. They'll claw back what they can. And what about Wraith himself? I looked at her. We've taken his operation apart, but he's still out there. Kira didn't answer right away. We'll find him. This doesn't end until he's done. Her conviction was ironclad, but I wasn't sure we could back it up. Wraith had resources, connections, and a network of shadows that stretched across continents. We'd exposed one corner of his empire, but we'd also made ourselves targets. The next morning, we found out just how badly Wraith wanted us silenced. I woke to Kira shaking me violently. "Connor, get up! Now!" I blinked, bleary-eyed. "What?" Before I could finish, a concussive boom shook the room. The windows shattered inward, glass spraying across the floor. My ears rang, and smoke filled the air. "They've found us!" Kira screamed, dragging me off the bed. My muscles were still stiff as she hauled me to my feet. Outside, tires screeched, and voices barked orders. "They're breaching the building!" I coughed, my throat burning as I stumbled toward the door. Kira grabbed our bags, the bare essentials, and we barreled into the narrow hallway. Smoke alarms blared overhead, an endless shriek piercing through my skull. We ran, Kira leading the way. Boots thundered behind us, doors bursting open as Wraith's men swept the motel. I caught glimpses of black tactical gear and weapons in their hands. No questions asked. Shoot on sight. Kira pulled me into the stairwell, and we sprinted down 2 steps at a time. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline numbing the ache in my legs. "We're not going to make it," I gasped. "Shut up and move," Kira barked. We hit the ground floor, smoke curling around us. Kira kicked open the exit door, and we stumbled into the alley behind the motel. The morning sun was harsh, blinding me for a second, but I heard engines revving. Black SUVs blocked both exits to the alley. "Trap," I muttered, panic rising. Kira didn't hesitate. "Over the fence!" We ran for the chain-link fence at the end of the alley. Behind us, doors slammed and voices shouted. I grabbed the fence, hauling myself up as bullets ricocheted off metal. Kira vaulted over first, landing hard on the other side. "Come on, Connor!" I dropped down beside her, my hands raw. We sprinted through backyards, cutting across narrow streets and slipping through gardens. Wraith's men were relentless, but we had one advantage. We knew how to run. By the time we hit the edge of town, we were breathless and filthy, but alive. Kira yanked open the door to an abandoned storage shed and shoved me inside. "We can't stay here," I panted. "We just need 5 minutes," Kira snapped, peeking out through a crack in the door. "They're combing every street." I collapsed onto a crate, every muscle in my body trembling. My mind was spinning. Wraith wasn't holding back anymore. He wanted us dead, and he wasn't afraid to burn the world down to make it happen. Kira slid down the wall next to me. "We need to disappear." I looked at her, my face twisted. "And then what? Hide for the rest of our lives?" "We hit him, Kira. We hurt him. He's not going to stop." She sighed, staring at her boots. "No, he won't." "So we take him out," I said, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. Kira raised an eyebrow. "Take him out?" "Finish it," I said. "No more running. No more hiding. We find Wraith, and we end him before he ends us." She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "All right, Connor. Let's burn the bastard down." That night, Kira and I sat in silence, planning our next move. Wraith had forced our hand. The only way out was through him, our target, the man who controlled the strings. We'd spent months unearthing his empire, but now we had to unearth him. Wraith was elusive, but not untouchable. His offshore accounts, his operatives, his safe houses, they all led somewhere. I stared at the map we'd spread out on the crate, red circles marking key locations. "We'll find him," I said, "and when we do, he won't see it coming." Kira grinned darkly. Time to turn the tables. Outside, the night was quiet, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Somewhere out there, Wraith was hunting us. But for the first time, we were hunting him back. One way or another, this was going to end. Over the next week, Kira and I worked in silence. The kind of silence that crackles with purpose. Wraith's empire, for all its shadows and layers, wasn't impenetrable. We had spent months gathering threads, and now we began pulling them. We targeted his network, strategically, surgically. Small strikes. A storage unit raided in Marseille, a safe house exposed in Hong Kong. Shell companies were anonymously reported to financial authorities, freezing chunks of his assets overnight. These weren't random acts. Each hit forced Wraith to shift, to communicate, to move. And every time he did, we got closer to him. It was exhausting work. Kira and I barely slept, alternating between poring over intel and scrubbing our tracks. Neither of us talked about what might happen if we failed. Failure wasn't an option. Then finally, we caught our break. It came through an encrypted message from an old darknet contact of mine, someone who owed me a favor and had no love for Wraith. Sighting confirmed. Private compound, Lake Garda, Italy. Heavy security. He's there. Kira's eyes met mine as I read the message aloud. That's it, she said. We've got him. Lake Garda, a secluded mansion perched on cliffs above turquoise water. A fortress, really. This was Wraith's stronghold, far from the chaos we'd unleashed in the cities. He thought he was untouchable here, protected by guards, surveillance, and miles of isolation. He wasn't. We flew into northern Italy on false passports, rented an unremarkable car, and checked into a dingy motel an hour away from the compound. From there, we observed. The mansion was sprawling, walled and surrounded by thick forest. Drones patrolled the skies. Guards with rifles roamed the grounds. Kira was the first to say it aloud. This is suicide. I couldn't disagree, but the compound had one vulnerability. A maintenance road winding down to the cliffs below. At night, supply boats delivered shipments under cover of darkness. It wasn't much of an opening, but it was enough. We spent 3 days preparing. I hacked into the compound's external surveillance feed, looping camera footage. Kira acquired supplies, thermal suits, climbing gear, and weapons we hoped we wouldn't need. On the 4th night, we moved. The descent down the cliffs was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The winds howled, spraying mist from the dark lake below. My hands ached as I gripped the climbing rope, every movement deliberate. Kira was ahead of me, her form a silhouette against the faint moonlight. We reached the base of the cliff, soaked and freezing. The supply boat had already come and gone, but the service tunnel remained open. Wraith's men didn't guard it heavily. They didn't think anyone could reach it. Their arrogance was our lifeline. Inside the tunnel, the air was damp and stale. We moved quietly, our footsteps muffled by the hum of machinery. Kira checked the map I'd sketched from blueprints I'd hacked days earlier. Security room first, she whispered. We found it easily. A single guard sat inside, half asleep, staring at a wall of monitors. He never saw Kira coming. She knocked him out with a quick blow, then cuffed him to the chair. Connor, cameras are yours, she said. I slid into the chair, cracking my knuckles as I faced the security system. The mansion's defenses were good, but I was better. I looped live footage to create blind spots in the guards' patrols. It wouldn't last forever, but it didn't need to. Go, I told Kira. We moved deeper into the mansion, shadows in a labyrinth of luxury. Kira led the way, pistol ready. I followed close behind, carrying the duffel with everything we needed to end Wraith once and for all. We found him in his study, a vast room lined with shelves of rare books and dimly lit by a crackling fireplace. Wraith sat behind an antique desk, swirling a glass of dark liquor. He looked exactly how I imagined, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and exuding power, even in repose. I was wondering when you'd show up, he said, his voice calm. Sit down, Connor. Kira. He knew us. I froze for half a second, caught off guard. Kira didn't hesitate. Her gun remained trained on him as we stepped closer. You didn't think we'd find you? Kira spat. Wraith smiled faintly. Oh, I knew you'd find me. I just didn't think you'd survive long enough to get here. I dropped the duffel onto the desk, unzipping it to reveal the hard drives we'd stolen, the ones containing evidence of his empire, his crimes, his connections. This ends tonight, I said. Everything you've built comes crashing down. Wraith leaned back in his chair, unbothered. Do you really think destroying me will change anything? You're children playing at justice. Cut me down and someone else takes my place. It's the way of the world. Not tonight, Kira said coldly. I pulled out a small device, a transmitter already wired into the hard drives. One click would upload every byte of Wraith's secrets to servers around the globe. The world would see it all, There'd be no spinning the story, no salvaging his reputation. You can't stop this, I told him. For the first time, Wraith's calm cracked. His eyes narrowed, lips curling into a snarl. You have no idea what you're doing. Maybe not, I said, but it's done. I clicked the button. Wraith shot to his feet, his chair toppling backward. You fools! The door burst open. Guards flooded in, shouting, guns raised. Kira fired first and chaos erupted. Run! I yelled. Kira and I bolted for the study side door as bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. I clutched the transmitter, praying the upload had started. Alarms wailed throughout the mansion as Wraith's men chased us. We sprinted through hallways, dodging gunfire. Smoke filled the air. Kira must have thrown a flashbang behind us. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. We burst into the service tunnel just as explosions rocked the mansion above. The boat we'd stashed below was our lifeline. We scrambled aboard, engines roaring to life. Wraith's men appeared at the cliffs, firing down at us, but we were already too far. Kira slumped beside me, bleeding from a graze on her arm. Did it upload? I glanced at the transmitter. The light blinked green. It's done. We didn't speak as the boat sped across the black water, Wraith's empire burning behind us. We docked the boat miles down the lake at an abandoned fishing pier. The sky was turning gray with the first light of dawn, but it felt far darker than that. Kira sat on the edge of the pier, holding a torn bit of cloth to her bleeding arm. I collapsed next to her, the adrenaline finally draining out of me, leaving nothing but bone-deep exhaustion. You think it's over? She muttered. I stared out across the water, where Wraith's fortress was nothing more than a memory of smoke and chaos. It's never really over, I said, but we gave him a fatal blow. The transmitter was dead now, its purpose fulfilled. The data, the hard drives, the entire web of Wraith's operation had been sent out to servers that no one could take back. Major news outlets would be picking it up in hours, blasting his empire into the light. Offshore accounts, trafficking networks, bribery and political puppetry, all his sins for the world to see. Kira and I had ensured Wraith couldn't bury this, but as his secrets spread across the globe, so did our fingerprints. Everyone's going to come after us now, she said quietly, pulling the bandage tighter on her arm. The people he worked with, the people who worked for him. I know. I rubbed my face, feeling the stubble scratch against my palms. But we knew the risks. Wraith couldn't keep going. Someone had to stop him. Kira shot me a sideways glance. And yet, stopping him didn't put any of that money back where it belongs. I froze. It was true. The millions, maybe billions, funneled through Wraith's operations were scattered in offshore accounts, shell corporations, and crooked investments. With the network's exposure, those assets might freeze or disappear forever. Thousands of people might be freed from his web, but no one was going to magically get their money back. And neither were we. The fallout came quicker than either of us expected. By the time we made it to a rented safe house in Geneva, every major news outlet was plastering Wraith's face across their screens. Billionaire philanthropist exposed as global crime kingpin. Network crumbles, from offshore accounts to drug rings. It was relentless. Governments launched investigations, bank accounts were frozen, and Wraith's allies turned on one another like rats in a sinking ship, but no one said our names. Not yet. This won't last, I said, shutting off the news report playing on my laptop. Wraith knows who we are. He's out there somewhere. Kira was pacing across the tiny living room, her movements quick and nervous. He'll want revenge. He'll need revenge. We've got to disappear, I said. She shook her head. That's not enough. He'll chase us. People like Wraith don't stop until the ledger's even. The weight of her words settled in my chest like a stone. She wasn't wrong. Wraith wasn't dead. And while his empire had been shattered, men like him always crawled out of the rubble, bloodied but alive. I sank into the chair and stared at the flickering streetlights through the window. Then we finish it, I said. We find him. Kira stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes blazing with something between disbelief and reluctant agreement. You're insane. Maybe, I said, but we can't spend our lives running. We end this once and for all. Over the next week, we pieced together scraps of Wraith's movements. The mansion explosion had driven him underground, but whispers of a private jet in Brazil, a broker in Istanbul, or an offshore yacht in the Mediterranean all hinted at a man rebuilding. Wraith had contingency plans layered on contingency plans. Taking him down completely would take something we hadn't yet risked. Total exposure. We hit him where it hurts most, I said one night, pointing at a map spread across the table. His identity, his remaining assets. Another hack, Kira asked. I nodded. He's got a clean name and enough money tucked away to start over. We find it. We erase it. You're betting everything on a digital ghost hunt, she said. It's the only option left. The days blurred together as we dove deeper into Wraith's final strongholds. I traced encrypted signals across continents. We uncovered his last financial conduits, small but resilient, and I dismantled them one by one. Kira stayed vigilant, watching our backs as our digital footsteps spread across networks full of dangerous people. Finally, we got a hit, a private security network operating off the coast of Montenegro. Hidden among the data packets was an address and a code name. Perseus. It had to be him. Is it real? Kira asked, her tone sharp with hope. It's real, I said. We've got him. The compound in Montenegro was smaller, less fortified than Lake Garda had been. Wraith was in hiding now, no longer the untouchable kingpin, but a man on the run. We approached under the cover of night, slipping past lazy guards who clearly hadn't anticipated an attack. By the time we breached the main building, I could hear the hum of a generator and smell the salt of the sea outside. And there he was. Wraith sat alone in a small office, surrounded by monitors showing news reports of his downfall. He looked smaller now, thinner, weaker, as though the weight of his empire had been keeping him whole. You've got nowhere left to run, I told him, stepping forward. Wraith turned slowly to face us, his expression grim but unbroken. Do you think you've won? He asked softly. You destroyed me, but what comes next? Do you think you can build a better world with your destruction? Chaos replaces kings, Connor. Always. I stared at him for a long moment, my mind racing. Maybe, I said finally, but this world doesn't belong to you anymore. Kira stepped beside me, raising her pistol. You're done. Wraith's lips curled faintly, the ghost of a smile. Then do it. We didn't need to. Within hours, international authorities raided the compound, alerted by the anonymous tip I'd sent from Wraith's own computer. As they dragged him away in handcuffs, I watched from a distance, feeling nothing. No triumph, no relief. Just emptiness. Kira turned to me. What now? I exhaled slowly. Now we disappear. For the first time in years, it felt like an honest answer.